All right, so get ready for this one, folks, because today we are diving deep, deep into the theory that Jesus might have actually used cannabis in his healing work.
Yeah, it's definitely a thought-provoking idea.
It is, right.
Yeah.
And we're exploring all this based on an audio file we found called Did Jesus Use Medicinal Cannabis? So, we're not here to say it's definitely true or false, but
Okay.
just to kind of like unpack it, look at the evidence, and see where it takes us.
Yeah, examine the arguments and see what we think.
Exactly. So one of the key things this whole theory hinges on is this idea of holy anointing oil.
Okay.
Like in Exodus 30.23, there's that recipe, right?
Yeah.
And it calls for like 9 pounds of cannabis.
Right. Cannabism.
And traditionally, it's always been interpreted as calamus, which is like a pretty common herb.
Yeah, you see that a lot in ancient texts.
But some scholars, like this guy Chris Bennett, they're like, hold on a second. What if cannabism is actually, cannabis?
Interesting.
So that's kind of the starting point of this whole thing.
And Bennett's argument is really fascinating. He points to how people reacted to Jesus's healing. Like, there's accounts of euphoria, altered perception.
Oh, like kind of out there experiences?
Exactly. And those sound very similar to, the effects of cannabis.
Okay, I see where he's going with that, but hold on a second. They were anointing people with this oil, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't that just make them smell nice? I mean, how's that going to lead to, like, actual healing or these crazy experiences?
Well, you have to think about the cultural and historical context.
Okay.
Anointing someone back then, it wasn't just like aromatherapy.
Right, it was like a big deal.
It was deeply symbolic, often tied to spiritual transformation, purification.
Ah.
So now, if this oil actually had cannabis in it, imagine that added layer of experience during these rituals.
Whoa, yeah. It kind of changes things, doesn't it?
It really does. It shifts our understanding from something purely symbolic to something potentially psychoactive.
Okay, that's a huge difference.
And it raises all sorts of new questions, like, did people experience altered states of consciousness during these rituals?
Right.
Did this contribute to the perceived power of Jesus's healing?
It's a whole new way of looking at it.
It really is a fascinating avenue to explore.
And it's not just Bennett who's saying this, right? Like, I think there was a Professor Carl Ruck who also supported the idea of cannabis being used in early Judaism and Christianity.
Professor Ruck makes a compelling case for that.
Right.
Yeah, he argues that cannabis use was well established in Judaism and likely carried over to early Christian practices.
And it's really interesting. The words Christ and Messiah, they both translate to the anointed one.
Exactly, which adds another layer to this whole theory.
Right. Because if the anointed one is literally referencing someone anointed with this oil, and the oil potentially contains cannabis, then, whoa.
It definitely makes you think.
It's mind-blowing. Okay, but even if we say, okay, maybe cannabis was in this oil, does it actually hold up medically?
Right, good point.
Like, what we know and now about cannabis, does it support the idea of Jesus using it to heal people?
That's a key question, and it's important to remember we can't just view this through a modern lens.
Right, of course.
But the modern understanding of cannabis does offer some interesting parallels.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Take, for example, the case of Charlotte Fiki. Do you know that story?
Yeah, isn't that the little girl with, like, a really bad epilepsy, Dravet syndrome or something?
Exactly. Dravet syndrome, a severe form of epilepsy.
And cannabis oil, like, really helped her.
Yes. She was having hundreds of seizures a week.
Oh, my gosh.
And when she started using cannabis oil, her seizures dropped drastically. I mean, we're talking going from over 1,000 seizures a month down to just 2.
That's incredible, but, I mean, that's just one case, right?
Of course. And it doesn't prove anything about Jesus.
Yeah.
But it does illustrate just how potent cannabis can be, particularly in oil form.
Right, and it kind of makes this ancient theory a little more believable.
Exactly. It gives it a modern-day echo.
And it's not just epilepsy, right? Like, people are using cannabis for all sorts of things now.
Absolutely. There's growing research on its potential for glaucoma, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even Crohn's disease and anxiety.
Wow.
27 states in the U.S. now have medical marijuana programs, so the therapeutic value of cannabis is being recognized more and more.
Yeah, it's definitely becoming more mainstream.
For sure.
Okay, so we've got this ancient recipe, claims of powerful healing, and modern research that kind of backs it up. But is there any actual evidence from Jesus's time?
Well, there's some fascinating archaeological evidence that points to cannabis use in that region.
Oh, really? Like what?
For example, there was this discovery in Beit Shemesh, Israel. They found the 1,623-year-old remains of a young girl.
Wow, 1,600 years old.
An analysis showed that she had cannabis in her system.
No way.
Archaeologists believe it was used to ease childbirth.
Whoa, so using cannabis for childbirth goes way, way back.
It certainly does. And that's not even the oldest find.
There's something even older.
There's a hemp rope dating back to 26,900 BC that was found in the Czech Republic.
What? 26,000 BC.
Hemp, which is a variety of cannabis, has been cultivated for its fiber for a very, very long time.
So people have been using this plant in different ways for millennia.
Absolutely, this discovery really highlights that.
It's amazing how something we think of as modern actually has such deep roots.
You know, it makes you wonder how much we've lost and forgotten over time.
It really does.
It makes you question what else might be out there waiting to be rediscovered.
Totally. But let's go back to the word cannibalism for a second.
Okay.
Isn't there also like a linguistic argument for the cannabis theory? Something about the origins of the word itself.
Professor Sula Benet, a Polish ethnologist, did some fascinating research on this.
Oh, yeah.
She suggested that the word cannabis actually comes from the Hebrew can, meaning hemp, and bosom, meaning aromatic.
Wait, hold on. So you're telling me that cannibalism literally translates to hemp in aromatic?
That's what Professor Benet proposed. And remember, those are the key ingredients in the holy anointing oil recipe.
Whoa. Okay, that's pretty wild.
Right. It's like the pieces of the puzzle are starting to fit together.
So are you saying cannibalism was like mistranslated somewhere along the way?
Well, Benet believed the mistranslation likely occurred in the Septuagint.
The what?
The Septuagint, it's the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible.
Okay.
And this version is really important because it was widely used by early Christians.
Ah, so if it was mistranslated there, that would have a huge impact.
Exactly. It would have created a ripple effect throughout history.
Wow. This is getting more and more interesting.
It really is. We have cannabism, potentially cannabis, in this holy oil used for healing, maybe even connected to the title Christ itself.
Right.
Plus, we have all this historical evidence suggesting cannabis use goes back thousands of years.
Okay, so it's pretty compelling.
It is compelling, but like with any good investigation, we need to look at all sides of the story.
Right. Of course, there are always counter-arguments.
Exactly, and we'll explore those in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've heard some pretty intriguing evidence for this whole cannabis theory.
Yeah, there are definitely some compelling arguments.
But, you know, like any good investigation, we got to look at both sides.
Absolutely. It's crucial to consider the counter-arguments as well.
So what are the arguments against Jesus using cannabis? What are the people who are saying, nope, not buying it?
Well, one of the most vocal critics of this theory is Professor John Musselman, a botanist.
A botanist. Okay, so he knows plants.
He really knows his stuff. And he argues that there's just no solid evidence to link any biblical herbs to marijuana.
So he's firmly in the calamus camp. Like he's saying cannabism is definitely calamus and that's that.
Pretty much, yeah. He believes that the whole cannabis interpretation is a bit of a stretch.
Okay, so it's not just that he doesn't like the idea of Jesus using cannabis.
Right. It's more about the evidence, or in this case, the lack of it.
What kind of evidence is he looking for? Like, what would convince him?
Well, one of his key points is that some proponents of the cannabis theory claim that calamus is too weak to have the effects described in the Bible.
Oh, like the euphoria and altered perception we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. But Musselman argues that that's simply not true, that consuming calamus can actually have pretty powerful effects.
Okay, so the potency argument doesn't really hold up.
Not according to him.
But what about, like, actual historical sources that directly link Jesus and cannabis?
Ah, well, that's where things get a little tricky.
Meaning?
That's the biggest challenge for the cannabis theory. There are no ancient texts or historical records that explicitly state that Jesus used cannabis.
Oh, so it's like we have all these pieces of the puzzle that seem to fit, but we're missing that one crucial piece.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And for scholars like Professor Musselman, this lack of direct evidence is a major sticking point.
So what do we do with that? Like, we have these compelling arguments on both sides, but no definitive proof.
That's the nature of history sometimes, isn't it? We're dealing with ancient texts, interpretations, and limited archaeological evidence.
Right.
We can't always say with 100% certainty what happened.
So are we just stuck? Like, is this mystery destined to remain unsolved?
Well, not necessarily. I think it's important to acknowledge the ambiguity.
Okay.
We can't definitively say Jesus did use cannabis, but we also can't completely rule it out.
So it's kind of up to each person to decide what they believe.
Exactly. It's about weighing the evidence and coming to your own conclusions.
And I think that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating, right?
Definitely.
It's not about finding the answer. It's about exploring the possibilities.
Yeah, and challenging assumptions.
And maybe even realizing that sometimes there isn't one clear-cut answer.
It's more about the journey of exploration.
I like that.
We've uncovered evidence of ancient cannabis use, explored its potential medicinal properties, and delved into the complexities of biblical interpretation.
And you know what else? This whole discussion has made me think about how our perception of cannabis has changed over time.
Oh, absolutely.
Like the fact that it's now being used medicinally and legally in many places adds another layer to this whole thing.
It really does. It makes you wonder how our views on cannabis will continue to evolve in the future.
It's a good reminder that history is not static. It's constantly being reinterpreted.
What might have been taboo in one era can become completely commonplace in another.
That's so true. Okay, so for everyone listening, we've reached a crossroads, a fork in the road. We've explored the intriguing evidence for and against the idea of Jesus using cannabis.
Both sides of the coin.
Now it's your turn. What do you think? Does the possibility of Jesus using cannabis change your perception of him or his teachings?
Does it make you question what we consider sacred or acceptable in different cultures and throughout history?
Those are big questions, and there's no right or wrong answer.
The important thing is that we're having these conversations, challenging our assumptions, and engaging with history in a meaningful way.
And who knows? Maybe this deep dive will spark a new curiosity in you, lead you down your own path of discovery.
The world is full of fascinating mysteries just waiting to be uncovered.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this, really ancient mystery, I'm curious, what are your main takeaways? Did any of the evidence really resonate with you, or did this whole exploration just leave you with more questions than answers?
You know, what strikes me is how this topic really highlights the intersection of faith, science, and history.
Yeah, for sure.
We've got these ancient texts that are open to interpretation, scientific discoveries about cannabis, and historical accounts.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. It's a complex puzzle with no easy answers.
And I think that's a good reminder that the past isn't always black and white.
Right.
There are gaps in our knowledge, multiple perspectives to consider,
Absolutely.
and there's always room for debate and discovery.
That's the beauty of it. It keeps us curious, encourages us to ask questions.
And reminds us that history is like a living, breathing thing. It's constantly evolving.
Exactly. We're not just passively absorbing facts, we're actively engaging with the past.
Yeah, trying to piece together a more complete understanding of the world and, everyone who came before us.
And I think that's a key takeaway for our listeners.
What's that?
Don't be afraid to, challenge assumptions, dig deeper into the things that intrigue you,
Right.
and embrace the ambiguity that often comes with exploring history.
Because sometimes the most thought-provoking questions are the ones that don't have easy answers.
Precisely.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So until our next deep dive,
Keep exploring. Keep questioning.
and keep those minds open.
Absolutely. And thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the theory of Jesus and cannabis. It's been a wild ride, and we hope you've enjoyed it.
We'll see you next time.